Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Abby Derr-Moore. Looking forward to this conversation, Abby. Really going to be cool.
Same here, Simon. What an honor. I have been so looking forward to this all morning. I was up early ready for this conversation.
Yeah. Obviously, this is a podcast rather than a video, but Abby's got the biggest smile going. So I know that we're in for a good conversation. So Abby is an international transracial adoptee. She's also a therapist, and you've got two different qualifications, haven't you, in the therapy stuff?
Yes, that's correct. I have a license in marriage and family therapy and a license in professional counseling.
Cool. So she knows her onions. Do you use that phrase in the States? She knows her onions, knows your onions. Yeah.
No, but I'm loving learning British terminology along the way.
She knows what she's talking about for the listener for the international listeners, and most of the people that listen to the show are outside the UK. So 70% of the downloads come from the States. So I do have to kind of check in with the English idioms. So one of the things that really Abby and I spoke a couple of months ago, and one of the things that really excited me when I found her website a couple of months before that was that she says on the website, I believe that every individual and family has the innate ability to heal, right? An innate ability to heal. And that's great. That kind of fundamental optimism. I think it's a big thing in a world that I believe has kind of become a little bit trauma obsessed. You know, we're focused. We're very focused on the darkness, and we don't. You know, we don't talk a lot about the light. It's mainly about the dark. How do you? Is that just me seeing it that way? Do you think that we're a little bit trauma obsessed somehow?
Yeah, I do I can definitely see this trend where yeah, as we've gotten more language around trauma, I think a lot of people are trying it on because I think a lot of people relate to the concept of trauma, especially since it's expanded. I think when trauma was first considered, right, it was really, at least in America, it was really only considered, trauma was considered when after all of the major world wars, where at the time we weren't even calling it trauma, we were just calling it shell shock. Um, and so then it expanded in the 80s, and they realized, oh, not only do veterans experience shell shock, but so do people at home, domestic violence, right? Child abuse. And so as it expanded, it's kind of one of those phenomenons where it's like, it's not that trauma got there's more people experiencing trauma. It's probably more that people got more language around trauma, and so they're really trying to learn what that means for them because trauma does, at its very core, can really disrupt someone's experience of who they are.
Yeah.
And that's something maybe we can talk about, a little bit more further into this conversation. But yes, I think right now one of the first stages of trauma is being able to um, feel those raw emotions you've probably hid in the darkness for a long time. And sometimes, though, I think we can get a little bit stuck because our knowledge, our understanding of trauma is way farther behind than what generations of many of us have had to experience. And so I think part of why we maybe are so focused on trauma is because now we have language for it, but our capacity to talk about how to heal is a lot more limited. And in fact, a big part of why I specialized and what I do. So for listeners listening in, I specialize in complex trauma, dissociative disorders, and attachment. And the one that I'm actually most specifically known for is dissociation because it is the least understood mental health condition, even though it's actually one of the most common. It's the third most common mental health symptom after anxiety, then depression. But yet it's the least understood clinically. And a huge part of um, being able to heal is for many of us who haven't had the language around trauma, we've had to dissociate off our trauma to then be able to cope and move forward in life. And so, unfortunately, there's not a lot of understanding around dissociation, which is a huge component to trauma. And so, when you don't know how to work through the dissociation, mental health professionals and clients, individuals, families alike are stuck. And that was a huge part of why I ended up specializing in this very niche field because it's so commonly experienced, yet it's so very, very misunderstood.
Yeah. So what does dissociative trauma dissociated trauma? What does that look like? How does that present in an adoptee?
Yeah, great question. Um, and so one thing I think is important to maybe set the stage up for is that dissociation is actually a coping mechanism to trauma. So, if anyone has experienced or knows, has witnessed a loved one struggle with post-traumatic symptomology, such as, nightmares, flashbacks, bodily reactions. Sometimes these feel like disproportionate reactions to the situation. Um, those can be really debilitating, right? If you're constantly having flashbacks, it's hard to work. If you're struggling to um, feel like you can just manage your present day, it can be hard to just take care of yourself in the day. It can be hard to socialize if you feel like you have worries that don't make sense to why you're worried or having anger outbursts to something that seems really small and innocuous. And so dissociation is a coping mechanism to that. So PTSD or post-traumatic symptomology is what we call hyper arousal, meaning your body, your nervous system is overly active. And dissociation is a way to try and maintain homeostasis. So I talked about in my website how I have a part of my journey in becoming a therapist was my love for biology. So I'm going to be a little bit of a biology nerd here and just explain homeostasis in terms it's the scientific word for balance. And so every system, whether it's living or non-living, wants to maintain a sense of homeostasis, a sense of balance. And so if you have a hyperactive nervous system, it can't do that for forever. It's going to have to crash. So we go into hypoarousal, meaning an underarousal. Our body shuts down, which many times people experience as depression. So people don't know this, but depression is actually a dissociative response. So in that shutdown, it's a way to kind of suppress. It feels like you're calming down your nerves, but it's actually a suppression of your nerves by trying to mentally compartmentalize away whatever is stressing you out. So, um, in terms of dissociation, the idea is if you can't physically escape a stressor, you'll mentally escape a stressor. So that's what dissociation is. So coming back to your question about how it shows up in adoptees, a very common dissociative process is what many adoptees, a common term in adoptee language is the adoption fog, the adoptee fog. Which, are you familiar with that concept?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's this concept of there's this large denial right, initially. So I've heard there's 5 stages of the adoptee fog. And one of those first stages is really that kind of denial stage, right? Like everything's good, everything's happy, and I've got a great family. And then there's kind of another stage of like being like, hey, something just kind of feels off. I don't know what it is, but it feels off. And so sometimes that sparks some exploration. And as they get a little further, they may realize, oh, this is what I've come to believe isn't as much of my reality. And then some of those raw feelings resurface, and some of those feelings are anger, grief, disappointment, confusion. They make sense of that, and then they move forward into being able to explore even more of what that means and integration of what that means for their own personal narrative. And so with the adoptee fog, the dissociative piece is that denial of things are fine, I'm following what I've been told.
But
Yeah, did you?
it's not a conscious decision. It's not a conscious
Mhm.
denial. So it's not like, I don't know, somebody that's 2 stone overweight or 5 stone overweight saying,
Mhm.
I'm perfectly thin. It's not that sort of denial. Or me, right? I'm not a particularly good driver. So, I've had a few car wrecks over the years. I don't say, but I'm a good driver. I just, but I could in that I could be deluded, right? I could deny it and say, no, I'm a great driver. I'm a great driver.
Mhm. Mhm.
That would be a conscious denial. But what you're talking about is, I think, is it an unconscious denial
Yeah.
because the brain is, I don't know how you would put it, frightened of being overloaded. So
Yep.
it's stuffing the tough stuff away so it doesn't, so it stays in homeostasis, so it stays in balance. Is that the sort of thing?
Yes, yes, fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Simon, for clarifying that. Yes, it isn't a conscious denial. It is a subconscious one in terms of it's our brain protecting us. Because you use the word overload. Really, it's the way our brain protects our psyche from literally going crazy. Um, because essentially, have you heard of the psychology term of cognitive dissonance?
It, it's the gap between reality and perceived reality. Is that what cognitive dissonance is? I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, very, very close. Yeah. So it's essentially just any time where you have two very conflicting beliefs, ideas, and or yeah, realities. And so what our brain does, we don't like that discrepancy because it doesn't feel homeostatic, so to speak. It doesn't make sense to our brain. So one way we try to reduce that discomfort that comes from this discrepancy, cognitive discrepancy, is we try and we use Freud didn't get a lot of things right, but he did get this part right. But Sigmund Freud kind of talked about defense mechanisms is how we reduce the cognitive dissonance. So denial is one of them, rationalizing is another, minimizing, um, conflating things, right? And so that's kind of what our brain is doing. It's not in an attempt to deny someone else's reality, although sometimes people's extreme of that can become that, but more so to protect ourselves from a reality we can't make sense of.
So it is the healing piece being it involves no longer stuffing the emotions. It's almost as if we're allowing them. The subconscious is becoming conscious as we're out of the fog, and we're feeling those emotions, and we're sitting with those emotions, and we're realizing that our emotions can't actually hurt us because I talk about nobody continues the metaphor after the fog. right?
Mm-hmm.
So we come out of the fog, and I'm thinking, well, what? So if what do we see if we continue the metaphor? So in previous episodes of the podcast, we've got to a state. Well, okay, so the fog has lifted, and we can see the dark clouds of trauma, right? And we can, the storm clouds, we can see rain lashing down. We can hear thunder. We're seeing splinters of lightning, and so and we are aware we've become aware of the trauma, and we think we think we're going to drown.
Mm-hmm.
We think we're going to drown in the rain, and we think we're going to drown in our tears, right? We think we're going to, we're worried about getting struck by lightning.
Mm-hmm.
It's a scary time, and then maybe we're going to try and stuff them again.
Mm-hmm. Yes. If we were to kind of expand on your metaphor, dissociation is kind of like, so yeah, the fog starts to subside, you see the dark clouds, and some people, if they feel a readiness to be able to withstand the dark, stormy clouds, and know that there's going to be, trust that there's going to be sunshine afterwards, they might stay out and, or maybe go into maybe like a little cottage or something, right? And watch it and wait for it to pass. And be able to watch the rain and realize, oh, the rain's not going to hurt me. I'm safe. I'm protected. Oh, that lightning looks scary. Oh, but I'm okay and I'm protected. But for those who maybe struggle with more dissociative processes, it's almost like they go into like they find the closest thing and it's a cave for them, let's say, where it's really dark and they can't they if they close themselves in the cave, they don't know they don't know what's gonna happen. They maybe hear all the sounds and that scares them even more, and they don't even give themselves a chance to see the sunshine that comes out later. And so part of that is what the work that I tend to do. I tend to work with those who are kind of in that cave, and help them slowly see that it's safe. But here's the thing, and this is where um, I think there are a lot of adoptees who are now talking. There's large communities. I mean, I don't know about you, Simon, but when I was a teen, right, most adoptees are starting to question a little bit, right? Because the identity stage of being a teenager, starts to formate and is especially exacerbated for adoptees. But I had nobody. All the books were written for adoptive parents. There were none for adoptees. Is that true for you, Simon,
Yeah,
growing
I
up?
mean, I didn't come out of the fog till I was 40.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm 56 now. So I did some work on myself, and then I kind of, there was another big kind of fog lift moment, probably 7 years later, 8 years
Okay.
later, I think, reading the primal wound, where I got very, yeah, I got I kind of suspected that adoption was a bigger issue. It was like I dealt with I dealt with a lot of business stuff, but I hadn't really looked closely at the adoption stuff, and then I did
Yeah.
years later. So it was like coming. You could, it was two big coming out of the fog moments, 8 years apart. But no, I didn't. But then I didn't go looking for community really to heal it. But 16 years ago, there wouldn't have been that. I mean, Facebook wasn't around, was it? So, and I think that's kind of what you're alluding to. That when so teenage years are traditionally are challenging for all kids.
Yes, yes. And when you don't have that guidance, right, then it's especially confusing. And so, now that we're having communities talk about it, it looks like more adoptees are talking about it. But I will argue when, I told somebody recently, a colleague of mine, she's like, how'd you become a therapist who works with adoptees? And I was like, well, I'm an adoptee myself, but an interesting little fact, I wasn't actually planning on working with other adoptees when I became a therapist. I first became really known for working with a disorder called dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. But working with adoptees actually kind of fell into my lap because I'd have parents who'd reach out and be like, my kid has attachment difficulties, or I think, it's related to their adoption. Will you work with them? And I was like, they're really little. Like they're like little kids, and the parents were anxious about trying to be proactive around attachment healing. But I was like, these little kids are like not going to like want to talk about adoption because I mean, even at in your adolescence, that can be very confronting at that's still a pretty relatively young age to be exploring that. And but what is interesting is I there was one family that asked me to work with their child, and I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna be good at it, but because I was like, I don't know if I've done enough of my own healing around it, but it was fascinating because my work in dissociation, which is you build a connection, you don't try and delve into the hard, heavy stuff in the beginning. It was interesting that eventually the kid would open up and would explore things. And then I started getting a lot more referrals from that. And so my point of that being is that dissociation, I do think there's a significant amount of adoptees. I can't tell you how many, but I would say there's still a significant and potentially it might still be the majority of adoptees who aren't ready to come out of their, going back to the metaphor, their cave. And so a lot of that work is when you work with dissociation, there's a concept of the slower you go, the faster they grow. And so one of the unique things I offer with my clients who are adoptees, and in particular, I tend to attract the ones who are in that first, maybe second stage of the adoptee fog. They will, a lot of my work with them is just building a connection with them, helping them feel safe. Let them know that, hey, you know what? I know that rain sounds pretty scary on the top of the rooftop, but it's it's not as scary. See, I'll bring in a raindrop for you. See, it is not that scary. And so I do essentially, I give the adoptee a chance to have that reparative attachment that they lost in their relinquishment, potentially within their adoptive family, if their adoptive family really, really struggled to help them at very young ages learn how to understand their feelings and show them that their feelings aren't as big and scary as they feel. Um, and so I tend to give that reparative experience. But one of those pieces that adoptive parents will always be limited by is they won't be able to mirror the child. Exact in the same way that when you've shared cells in a body with the woman that gave birth to you, it'll be always be imperfect to some degree. And so the hope is we educate parents to learn how as closely as possible to model that. But a lot of the times parents, adoptive parents, don't get a lot of education around how do you help a child have their feelings. A lot of adoptive parents, interestingly, like there's a concept of like attracts like. And what can happen with a child that you're attaching to and that they're trying to attach to you is you can bring out each other's unresolved work. And so parents sometimes don't know also how to maybe regulate their own emotions. And if they don't know how to do that, then they can't model that for the child. And so then emotions feel big and scary to the parent and the child.
So healing is essentially the process of becoming less scared about your emotions.
A piece of that. It's also, I'd argue that being an attachment specialist, it's actually having a safe connection. And so with dissociation, so remember, dissociation is a mental escape. And in particular, another definition of component, I should say, another component dissociation is that dissociation is just anytime you're not in the present moment. So we all dissociate to some degree. So like if you forget where you put your keys or you're thinking of what to have for lunch mid conversation, right? That's dissociation. Um, and so the opposite of dissociation is mindfulness, being in the present moment. But the antidote to dissociation is a safe connection because dissociation, another kind of synonym, an oversimplification synonym, is disconnection, right? If you disconnect with memories or disconnect emotionally with someone you're relating to, right?
So this is why the connection with the therapist, the connection with other adoptees is so vital, because on one level, we're talking about being less scared by our feelings. On another level, we're talking about feeling safe in somebody else's company.
Yeah. Yeah. And trusting that they'll stay, because that's another component, right? Like some of us adoptees had experience, whether we consciously remember it or not, some of us did have a safe connection with our birth mothers, because everyone's circumstance is different. But the fear, and I'm sure you've probably, in all the episodes you've done, I'm sure you've heard a couple of different times about how like there are fears that people will stay, right? Like that theme of like, I'm gonna bounce from one person to the next because I don't know if you're gonna stay, so I'm gonna cut it off before you can cut me off, right? And so it's really essentially my work is pretty much giving them that experience where they got developmentally stuck. So, for example, if you know Erickson's stage of development, most adoptees tend to have a major disruption in that first stage of development, which is learning how uh, the concept of trust versus mistrust. Who can I trust to take care of me? And this is why sometimes people can have, when they've had a pre-verbal attachment trauma, they can really struggle to connect with other people because they don't know if you're gonna keep them safe. And they can act almost really, quote, childish, but it's because they have a part of them that's really stuck in that stage, trying to make sense and find resolution in that stage through a trusting relationship.
Yeah. So what did your own healing journey look like, Abby?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, the timing of that question is, I think, such a great segue into, or sorry, what we were just talking about is a great segue into the answer to that question for me. So a huge part of it where I started off as an adoptee and ultimately why I became an attachment specialist was because for me, the first hit of the adoptee fog came at me when I was 15. And it came in the form, for me specifically, it came in the form of all of a sudden I had this like deep grief of my birth mother, like just utter grief, like as if she like I known her my whole life and she passed away. And so, just so some context, I was um, adopted at the age of 3. Um, and my paperwork initially stated that I was found at 6 days old. But when I was 15 and this grief came up, I was like, gosh, like, why am I feeling this pain? And I would talk to some other adoptees that I knew, and none of them, some of them might share some curiosity or, and, some sadness, some anger towards their birth mother. But no one I met was able to share anything about, like, they didn't talk about this deep level of grief I was feeling. Like, I mean, I will admit it was a suicidal grief for me. Like this feeling of like I can't live without you. And
Wow.
um when I realized that others weren't talking about that, I was like, well, I wanted to make sense of why I was feeling such deep grief. So long story short, I did extensive research on attachment. And in fact, in graduate school, I did domestic and international research on attachment. And came to the conclusion, I was like, I don't think my paperwork is accurate. And I was like, I think I had more time with my own mother. And so when I went to go search for my mother back in 2019, um, I ended up finding some fascinating facts about myself. People actually remembered me, which I was really surprised by. And I had people confirm that I was actually more like closer to 8 to 9 months old when they found me. And what was fascinating is in my research, I had actually predicted that's about how old I had to have been. And so that is what spurred. I was like, okay, I must be onto something. It could be also, I will own, it could have also been it could have been coincidence. But I was like, I'm wondering if I'm onto something here a little bit about kind of developmental attachment and how your body holds all of that. And so, yeah, that was really my journey into it. And so that's why I became an attachment specialist and went the attachment route versus I hear a lot of adoptee therapists, they tend to kind of go the identity route, which I think is really valid and really important. Um, but the attachment was the thing I felt like was a little unique amongst my colleagues and really healing through that rather than just exploring, continuing the identity formation, which is a lifelong process. I started to see like, oh, the healing process is through the attachment. So then a lot of my own healing was being able to find those safe connections.
So, but that started at 15 after this, you talk about like a suicidal grief. After that, you kind of lost yourself in the research process.
Yeah, I did. I did for quite a bit. So I like you, Simon. That's interesting. I'm kind of curious now if others experience this, but like you, I had kind of two major stages of the adoptee fog as well. So 15 was like curiosity of my own history. And then when I went back to China in 2019, the year before that, 2018, I did a ton of sleuthing about my specific background, um, and found quite a bit of information. Um,
But the obviously the research process is quite sort of brainy. It's a brain thing, right?
yeah, that's a
An
good point. Yeah.
attachment kind of feels like a feeling thing, not a brain thing.
Mm,
So
yes.
I'm interested. Presumably, there's more than just. Did you start your own? Did you start therapy yourself, or did you? What else? What did you do? Did you just? You can't just research yourself out of this. Is that what you did?
Oh no, very perceptive question, Simon. Yeah, so no, you're right. There is a cognitive piece, and there's something I will name that was kind of exhilarating. You feel like you're part of like you know, um, a true crime kind of situation. It wasn't a crime, but well, it could have been a crime depending on how people you would look at it. But it was very interesting to kind of have that detective experience. But um, actually, honestly, the way I successfully found the information that I did was through the feeling. This is why I became a somatic a somatic therapist is because the second stage of my adoptee fog started because when I went back to China for the first time in 2017, I came back with flashbacks of things I was like, all of a sudden I was remembering stuff, but I didn't know what I was remembering. And so that's actually what, was the catalyst for me to research more about my background because I wasn't actually ever planning on looking for my birth parents. I knew subconsciously is like, if you look for your birth parents, you're gonna be sordidly disappointed. But when I started having the memories, I was like, oh my gosh, I might actually remember the last time I was with my mother. So, just to give you a little context too, Simon, the circumstance with Chinese adoptions, it's really sad because it really, as with many international adoptions, most of those adoptees are coming from a very, very chaotic socio-political climate, right? And so for China, it was the one-child policy. Um, and so um, one piece was is like, oh, I think I was maybe taken from my mother because I had this horrible flashback of being on a train with someone I that I was afraid was going to hurt me. And so when I did all of that, I followed my gut. I followed what I could remember. I followed, how my body reacted to different things. And it's actually what pushed me. Like I did some things that um some people were like, I don't know. I wouldn't have had the guts to do that. But because I had such a strong gut instinct, I was like, it's worth the risk. Do it, say it, ask it, And yeah, my body, almost every single step, my body was correct on everything to the point of I found the train I was taken on, and I took the exact same train that I was on 25 years prior. And that's pretty incredible because in Asian countries, public transit is a much bigger thing than it is for my American listeners. In that trains are everywhere. So the fact I was able to identify the exact train I was taken on was absolutely incredible. So in my journey, it was actually, yes, there was a lot of sleuthing work, but quite honestly, the sleuthing was definitely uh, guided by my somatic experience of what I could remember. And of course, you're right. I did definitely do a significant amount of therapy. I worked with a somatic therapist, and that really helped me work through the nervous system, calming down my nervous system. But at the time, I really also didn't want to calm down my nervous system because I was like, my body remembers something. I don't want to forget it while I do this. So it was after when I learned what it all had happened, that's when my body started to heal itself a little bit because it could feel like it could let go of that information.
Wow. Wow. So I'm guessing that the healing is very different from a professional perspective. Then you're in Oregon, right? You're not taking adoptee clients to China or South Korea, putting them on trains as part of their thing. It's a different kind of. It's this. I'm guessing is it the somatic approach? What's the somatic approach? Is it body work? Is it what is it?
Yeah, there's a lot of versions of it. And yes, you're absolutely right. I don't put my clients in traumatizing situations. But somatic work is what most people think of somatic work as being able to reenact it in a way where you let your body do what it would like for itself to do. So let's say like if you got in a car crash and you wanted to put your arm up in front of your face to protect your face from the glass that your brain knew was going to shatter. But you maybe let's say you weren't able to do it because your arm's pinned down by something, then that can be traumatic because your body didn't get to do what it wanted to do, which was to cover your face and protect it. And so a simple form, this is a very oversimplified example, but is to be able to kind of let the client, when the client feels ready, to recreate the scene in their mind, and then being able to physically protect their body with their arm the way that they had wished they had. And what's cool about it is it discharges the traumatic energy stuck in the body. But actually, what I found is sometimes, especially because I work with complex trauma, and a lot of these clients are survivors of really severe relational abuse. Um, they'll tell me, if I did what I thought I should have done, for example, if I tried to run away, then I realized what would have happened is they would have just caught me because I was so little. I was like, for example, 5, and they would have caught me, and then they would have beat me. And so then they learned that actually their body did do the smartest, safest thing for them. And then there's relief in knowing that their body didn't betray them. It saved them. And so that's a somatic experiencing, and that's what I did when I went back on that train. I went in going, I'm going to reenact this, but I'm going to do it the way that I wished I could have done it. And that was how I healed that particular trauma. There's a lot of others, but that's somatic experiencing. The other healing piece is what's called psychosomatics, which is when you can't express a psychological distress, it'll manifest in a physiological ailment. So, for example, a common one is arthritis. They found that people who have rheumatoid arthritis, where their joints just flame up on them, is they found there's a correlation, a very significant correlation, that people who have rheumatoid arthritis are typically caretakers, and they overextend themselves to caretake for others, and that the only way that they can stop taking care of others is if they literally can't use their hands, the thing that they symbolically and literally give to people. And so some of my work too is doing that psychosomatic work, where if someone who has a chronic illness, we work through, I literally have a whole dictionary, a whole book about what different physical ailments symbolize regarding psychological stressors.
Wow. Wow. I find it sometimes tricky with the having interviewing a therapist such as yourself for the podcast, when I'm realizing that we can't, like, relinquishment trauma is pre-verbal so much. Mm-hmm. So talking about it doesn't do any good because it's about words. So mm-hmm. Yeah, it's about verbiage for something that's pre-verbal, and clearly we can't. We're having a conversation. This isn't a somatic therapy session, right?
Right.
Yeah, I'm wondering, what is it that you can share in our conversation that can help the listeners in some way?
Yeah. So, regarding, I'm going to come back to the core thing that of how to heal dissociation and trauma. In terms of trauma, there are 4 components that contribute to an experience being traumatic. So many people know this one, or they viscerally know this one, which is if there's a loss of control, it's more likely to be experienced as a traumatic event. If it's beyond a person's ability to master at the time, meaning like, for example, relinquishment is something that's beyond an infant's ability to master at the time, because they don't know, they're still dependent on an attachment figure to meet their basic needs for shelter, food, water, things like that, right? And so if they're abandoned, even for a couple of hours, then the thing is that they don't have the skill set, the capacity to be able to know how to manage. They don't know that 3 hours is not a lot of time for an adult perspective, but for a child's perspective, you every minute could be a life or death situation, right? So beyond a person's ability to master, if there isn't resolution, meaning there wasn't something that kept them completely safe, and if there was a lost ability to trust one's own gut. So this is where gaslighting in particular can be really, really damaging, is like if you make them question, if you make an individual question their own reality. And so here's the thing, where adoptees, I would argue adoptees, lots of adoptees, if not all, have probably had a dissociative response because most of them, if not all of them, have all four components of what makes something traumatic, especially if you're little. And so, um, right. So, for example, even as an infant, like the lost ability to try and trust one's own gut, literal gut. If you're hungry, but mom's not around to feed you, you can't trust it anymore. Right. And so, what a huge part of where I would invite people to maybe work through is that, again, that safe connection that you choose, you decide is safe. That is somebody who can scaffold you through through some of the stuff maybe you don't know how to do. To be with somebody who will try and help you um, uh, either come up with a solution or sit with you until the situation resolves itself, such as sitting through the storm, so to speak. And then helping, believing in someone. That is the number one thing I found my clients share with me is they're like, the one thing that you've taught me, of all the things you taught me, is that you make me believe in myself and that you won't try and solve my problems, but you will use, you'll reflect back my strengths to me and tell me that, you know, express your trust that I will be able to figure it out. And I've had multiple clients say that's one of the most healing things they've had is that connection with them. I trust them, but also that they feel safe and they know I'm not going to push them. So if you are someone who's a little bit not ready to come out of the fog quite yet, I'd encourage you to find a therapist who's willing to go slow. They don't have to be a dissociation specialist, but someone who's truly willing to go your pace. Because the moment even if it's for your best and out of your best interest to kind of push you into facing a certain reality, it's taking away your control and makes that a re-traumatizing, potentially a slightly re-traumatizing experience. So find somebody who can give you those four components of control, scaffolding, a sense of resolution or being able to sit with you until resolution, and then being able to help you learn to trust your gut again, believe in you.
So that's great. One of the things that's coming to my mind is, we think, I talked about, I came up with this metaphor of the layer cake of trauma. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, number one, we're working on a time basis, right? So we've got some generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
People have generational trauma. So persecuted groups, for example, like Jewish people or Africans who were enslaved, right? So there's some and that's passed down through generations, right? So then you've got the another sort of generational trauma is that kind of, people talk about the experience in the womb. So if the birth mother is under severe stress, right?
Yeah.
Then you're bathing in a load of toxic chemicals like cortisol and all this sort of stuff. You've got this. It isn't the normal safe bath that it should be in the womb.
Yes. Yeah. Beautiful metaphor.
Yeah. Then you've got the kind of the relinquishment you got a relinquishment trauma. Then you've got some maybe some trauma that goes on in the adoptive family, and then if you can bring another layer in, the kind of like the transracial layer. So you kind of, not only do you feel different, like a white kid adopted into a white family might feel, because of all this stuff that's gone on before. You look different, and those two things kind of feed each other, so the degree of otherness kind of grows, right?
Yeah.
So you've got these different layers of trauma, and it strikes me that, you know, the stuff that goes on, when you talked about the trust and the gaslighting, if we, you know, out on social media, you can see all ranges, you can see a whole range of spectrum of levels of trauma. But if you've had a bad experience in the adoptive family, you're going to kind of blame, your trauma is going to dial up and up and up. And then you're going to have lots of as well as the subconscious stuff, you've got the conscious memory stuff, and the gaslighting, and you know, you talk about this lack of preparation. So what happens is the parents are triggered by the kids' trauma, and basically it just becomes a big trauma ball of stuff that goes up and up and up, and the bigger that grows, the more and more stress that person comes. So that this gaslighting thing, where the uneducated parent reacts in a way that doesn't fit with the adopted kid, it's just gonna, this stuff is just gonna grow and grow and grow. And it becomes the whole lens that somebody views their life through.
Yeah,
I think layers stack on one another. The layers, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where, you know, my specialty in complex trauma, dissociation, and attachment. You know, even though I had my own self-doubts, which was my own personal, you know, self-consciousness, at the time when I first started specializing. The irony of it is like I'm probably the best to work with adoptees. You know, at the time I just didn't have the self-confidence, but I was probably the best to work with adoptees, because one piece of you know, that all of the major disorders that I work with all have those three components: complex trauma, dissociation, and attachment. And adoptees are no different. They almost all of them have all three of those components. And what you're describing as this layered cake is complex trauma. And that's one thing too that I want to really validate, because I think, you know, when we started, kind of coming back full circle, when we started this conversation, you said, you know, everyone's focused on trauma and what does it mean? And I think sometimes too, part of why people are fixated on this concept of trauma is because they're like wondering, is my experience of something truly traumatic, or was it that bad, quote? And the thing is if it has an impact on you, again, if you're missing, you know, if you have a loss of control, or, you know, inability to handle it because it's not within your developmental toolbox, yeah, it's going to be traumatic. And one of those things is complex trauma. You don't have to have big major traumas where you've experienced assault or you've experienced, you know, a war. It can be, you know, those little traumas can be enough to break the camel's back. It's like if you think of, you know, adding straws to the camel's back, there can be one of them that can be the straw that breaks that camel's back cumulatively. And cumulative trauma is really difficult to work with because people are quick to minimize those isolated traumas and seeing them as, well, they're not really traumatic. But then it's still having an impact on them. And so a lot of that work is actually helping them see that no, cumulatively, you've been through a lot, and cumulatively, it makes it hard for you to make sense of what is stable in this world
Yeah.
for you.
So that's why I, like with the cake idea,
Mm-hmm.
um, that in my head it's like different layers, but not
Mm-hmm.
all layers are present. So I don't have, as a white guy adopted by white folks, I don't have that layer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have. I had a pretty cool set of parents, it seems to me, compared to a lot of stuff that I hear. And I was 5 weeks old, so I didn't have that 9 month of attachment break that you did. So
Mm-hmm.
it's about looking at the different levels, but the cumulative thing is the biggest cake. That
Mm-hmm.
cumulative. Um, so can you just go back to the three things, because you said disassociation, attachment, and what was the third one?
Complex trauma.
So the thing the bit that I can see is it, it's we can look at we can look at ourselves and our own experiences through those three different lenses, and I think what I've been, when you explain that disassociation is being not in the moment,
Mm-hmm.
that really that really lit something up for me, because I was thinking about not in the moment. I was thinking of Eckhart Tolle and the power of now,
Mm-hmm.
and,
Yeah.
and that's all about that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I can see that basically I've been focusing on that bit.
Mm-hmm.
I've been focusing on that bit as my healing strategy, should we say?
Mm-hmm.
I've in terms of attachment. Well, I've been with my wife for like 30 years this year.
Congratulations.
So, and I have some friends. I don't have friends from that I'm still in touch with from school, but I've got some of my friends I've known like 30 years. So I can see, right, well, from that attachment, I'm not 100% on that, but I can see that that's a strength.
Mm-hmm.
There's a strength there. So it's more to, for me, it's more to look at the um, the 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 relinquishment piece. That's that that connection. Maybe. Are you sure you said that, the three things? Because I wrote down disassociation, attachment. Complex trauma doesn't seem to go as the third layer. The third
Well, well,
the
I was
third layer
referring
of
to
that.
what I
Sorry.
Oh yeah, I was just referring to what I specialize in. Most adoptees have complex trauma. They don't have simple, I don't like this terminology, but they call it simple trauma. Um, I would just say simple trauma is more like better defined as single layered trauma, meaning like, let's say you've never had a trauma in your life, but then you get into a really scary car accident. That would be a quote simple trauma. Um, but adoptees will have complex trauma. And part of the work and healing is that what you were talking about, that layered cake, working on each level of that cake. And one, I want to take a moment because I could be wrong, but I kind of heard you almost minimizing your experience of adoption in relation to mine, in that I think you potentially still have quite a significant amount, because one that we don't talk about enough is I so love, Simon, that you brought up the intergenerational layer. We do not talk about that enough. And that intergenerational layer is already a cumulative trauma that is put onto this, newborn camel's back. And that one is so complex for adoptees because not only are they carrying their biological, genetic intergenerational trauma, they are carrying also the adoptive intergenerational trauma as well. And that is something, again, we're looking at many of us who are adoptees, we were little, very, very little. Um, Many of us were infants when we came into our adoptive family. So we're expecting an infant to carry double the trauma of intergenerational trauma before we even look at maybe even the adoptive layer of that system within that one insular system. And so um, part of that complex trauma piece is making sure you go through those different layers. And that's actually that's another thing I think that kind of makes me unique as well amongst my colleagues is a lot of my work as an adoptee is actually working with the adoptive parents and being able to not call out. I do think we right now as adoptees are having more of a voice. Naturally so, they're going to use their voice, but I think we're kind of in a place where we're calling out rather than calling in behavior that needs to change. And I think something I do offer adoptive families, something that they've shared with me is that they do feel safe to share like their fears and their concerns, and it's a very collaborative process. I actually run support groups for adoptive parents, and they know that I'm an adoptee, and I share with them. I was like, I recognize that some adoptive parents are afraid to speak openly in front of an adoptee out of fear they might offend me, but I'm going to encourage, like, have your raw feelings. We all have our raw feelings in hopes to model for them that when their child has a raw feeling, that it'll be okay. They're allowed to have a raw feeling and help them make sense of it. And that's kind of what I do with adoptive parents is when they say, yeah, there are days I don't even know, like, did I make the right choice? And and they're afraid to say that because they're afraid of how that will feel to an adoptee. And I'll say, well, it sounds like it's really hard parenting. Even biological parents sometimes think that, right? And so, but it's really being able to call them in and say, now let's really look at what's behind that fear, right? Is it, for example, they're afraid they're not going to be an adequate parent, not necessarily that, you know, there's something wrong with their child, but we have to be able to call them in and create enough safety for them to be vulnerable enough to explore that.
Yeah. On the back of that question, a couple of things come to mind in terms of like, I talked about attachment with my missus and my friends, but also
Mm-hmm.
I consider myself fairly well attached to my parents.
Yeah.
But I've only got one bit on that. I've only got one kind of recollection of that because, especially with my dad, I had run-ins with him, especially when I was working with him when I was in my 20s. But I hang on to a thing that my sister said. I've got an adopted sister 2 years younger than me, not biologically related. Did it just brought up by the same family? She said, "Do you?" When she was 10, I was 12, something like that. She said, "Do you ever think about finding your real parents?" And I said, "No, mum and dad are our real parents." And so I was clearly, I hang on to that as a lever, like that. That's a linchpin in the thing. That's the only bit that I can see really with that's the cast iron proof in my little head about attachment. And yet, and the others, like when that attachment has been less strong, perhaps, and there's been anger and anger towards our adoptive parents,
Mm-hmm.
and we're saying, that rather than grace, what role do you see a lot of that? I mean, if you're dealing with younger kids, perhaps less so, but doesn't that make us suffer more? This kind of this righteous anger.
The righteous anger, well, maybe, and I think maybe that's part of the process, though. I don't want to dismiss that. Uh, in terms of, I do think that anger does need to be a part of it. And in fact, I think we live in a society that pushes people to forgive before they're ready. And part of anger, so I would argue that anger is a truth speaker emotion. It will always speak the truth. Now, you might have I know you and I have talked about IFS, right? And, you know, angry parts can sometimes be suppressed by protector parts. They're like, oh, don't get angry, otherwise people won't want to hang out or, want to be around you. But anger is a truth speaker. Anger is an emotion that knows what you deserve. That's why they tend to be very justice oriented emotions. And I don't think that's wrong. And I think this is where I would argue, this is why I like working with adoptive parents, is because I don't really think it's the job of the adoptee, no matter how young or old they are, it's the job of the adoptee to again have to go back to what they've had to do, which is suppress how they really feel, placate other people's emotions. But really, it's the job of the adoptive parent to be able to handle it and say, of course, this is not to say like being able to tolerate abusive reactions. That's not okay. But being able to recognize that it's okay if the adoptee is angry.
Yeah.
And they might at the time blame your parenting or even you for it. But that's part of their process. And then I think part of it is if it is leading to suffering rather than catharsis or reprocessing, then I think they'll get their natural consequence of like, I am kind of miserable in my anger. It's not changing anything. It just distances me from what I want or who I want to be with. But I think that has to be part of their process. They have to, just like a little kid who's angry and upset that you won't give them a lollipop before dinner. They have to learn oh, they won't appreciate in the moment that you as a parent are making sure they don't spoil their dinner so that way they can eat a nutritious meal, but they might get it later down the road, right? And that's part of, I think, working with adoptive parents is I'm putting the onus back on the adoptive parent to help them learn how to
Yeah.
regulate and understand their emotions. That maybe the adoptee is an adult now, but they really needed that from the parent. And maybe that doesn't happen through their adoptive parents because maybe they passed away or they no longer have a connection or a very sparse connection. And so that's where me as a therapist or just even as a friend to say, hey, it's okay, it's okay to be angry. It that you didn't get what you needed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen something there. I'm not quite sure if I can put it into words or not. Yeah, when I do work with adoptive parents, when I do sometimes do webinars with them, I tend to one of my central messages is very similar to what you just said. I said, well, the number one thing here really is for you not to take your kids' trauma personally.
Yeah.
Because it ain't about you.
Mm-hmm.
It ain't about you. The trauma isn't about you. And also there's that. But it is all about you. It is your ability. So you think it's about the kid. You think it's about your kid's trauma. It's not. Your job is your response, your ability not to take it personally. Whereas, kind of, I've heard this from a lot of different therapists who work with adopted parents. like TBRI, I think it was a TBRI practitioner, said, look, every parent that rings up pretty much says, fix my kid.
Yep.
And they and the therapist has to say, no, it's not about the kid, it's about you. And they've got to say that in a very tactful way.
Sure.
Or else they ain't going to be working, they ain't going to be supporting that family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, what the anger is, the truth teller, is huge. But then the righteous anger on the back of that scares the bejesus out of me.
Yeah, and that's where I'm wondering, again, I think something I do want to name is it's a real skill. Parenting is a skill. We make it seem like it's an innate thing. Um, you know, Birthing a child, being a mother there's a natural process to that. But parenting is is not an innate skill. And I think that's where I like to expand on um, this isn't just an adoptee specific issue. This is like everywhere where we're not really teaching parents how to build their own self-regulation skills and then learning how to redirect and hold space for a young child who doesn't understand their own emotions. And I think honestly, um, that's something one day I would hope that there's more of talking about that when you know parents go through foster care, adoption, home study, and courses and things like that, is really assessing those things of like, do you have that skill? Because if they don't come in prepared with that skill, then adoption ends up being traumatizing for also the parent, the adoptive parent,
Yeah.
because they also don't have control or experience.
And if we look at what's happening now, which is
Mm-hmm.
still not enough. And then we
Mm-hmm.
look at what was happening 56 years ago. Did I show you did I show you that I got when I got my adoption file, I got a copy of a booklet for about post adoption. It was a post adoption booklet. Did I show you that?
No, you didn't.
It, it's basically, I say booklet, I'm massively overstating it. It's about 2 pages of A4.
Oh, interesting. Yep.
Two
Yep.
pages of A4. So maybe 800 words.
Yeah.
Do you know
A
what I mean?
little college essay.
Uh, well, not an essay, like the introduction to an essay.
Sure,
Do
that's a
you know
good
what I mean?
point.
Like
Yeah.
how many words have we spoken in the last hour and 15 minutes? We've
Yeah.
spoken more words, and and if but if we as adoptees are judging um, parents on today's level, then
Mm-hmm.
they're always going to be coming up really short, aren't they?
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that, Simon. I think that's something, um, coming back, I think that maybe does lend to some of that maybe self-righteous anger that you talk about. And I think that is unfair. Something I also had felt very different with the adoptive community was I didn't feel like it was fair to put my, you know, see that as a shortcoming. I think definitely, my relationship with my adoptive parents definitely had its ups and downs.
Yeah.
Um, but I will share. I've never blamed them for my adoption struggles. I knew that was just isolated to my experience, and they tried their best. And even if it was misinformed, I had so much compassion and understanding for what very little they got. And they actually, I think they did a fantastic job with what little information they got. And I think I did a fantastic job with what little information I had. But I think you're absolutely right. I really appreciate you naming that. It's not a really fair comparison to be like, now that we've had this advent of understanding adoption trauma that happened, probably my sense of it was around like you know, maybe even 2015, where it really just, ramped up. We haven't had even almost a decade's worth of that advent happening. And yeah, it can be a little unfair. And I think part of it is, again, people want to blame and externalize, but if the skill piece is being able, like you said, not to take it personally and to really be able to be like, what is this really about? When you hate somebody, hating someone actually has very little to do about the person. It's about, or in terms of who they are, but it's more about what they've done, like not listening to them, feeling abandoned by them because they aren't spending the time or the energy. Those are the things. So being able to talk through the behavioral stuff. Lots of times, when we say we hate someone or we believe they owe us something, is really more so there's a behavior that we dislike, but we don't know how to say what about that behavior um, is feeling like we're not getting a need met. But it doesn't mean that they themselves are so flawed that they're unredeemable or can't be in our lives, things like that.
I think we've just got our next subject for a podcast in 6 months or whenever you're ready. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And I also conscious we've taken a lot of your time today. And if you've stayed with us this long, listeners, thank you very much. If you haven't, then you're not hearing this message. So as usual, listeners, there's links to Abby's website and socials in there in the show notes. And before I wrap it up, just is there anything else that you'd like to share before we do that?
Yeah, the only thing is, thank you so much, Simon. This was a very, very stimulating conversation, and what an honor to be able to have it and have real depth to it. I very much enjoy these in-depth conversations, and it's a special thing if this one's being broadcasted. So thank you, Simon, for your time and just your perceptiveness and deep thoughtfulness. I know we didn't talk much about specifically what you offer within this episode, but just what you've alluded to, I think you're doing some powerful work on your end as well, within yourself and for the adoptive community, including other parts of the constellation, not just adoptees, but hearing that you work with adoptive parents is, I think, a really valuable thing.
Thank you. Thanks,
Yeah.
listeners. We'll speak to you very soon. Take care.